Hollywood's elites thought they had buried Mel Gibson for good. But when leaked emails exposed their secret plan to blacklist him, the man they tried to destroy came back swinging with a project that could shatter their entire system. If you appreciate stories that celebrate real human values, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Now let's continue. Mel Gibson's resurgence in 2025 with Flight Risk wasn't just a cinematic comeback. It was a cultural statement. The film, an unapologetic nod to old-school action with moral undertones, struck a chord with audiences tired of Hollywood's shallow, agenda-driven offerings. Critics, predictably, scoffed, labeling it outdated and dismissing Gibson as a relic of a bygone era. Yet theaters were packed with viewers who resonated with the film's deeper message: courage, redemption, and the strength of family. Amid this success, Gibson casually teased a bigger project in an interview. The resurrection of the Christ is closer than people think. It's going to be the most ambitious thing I've ever done. That single statement sent shockwaves through an industry already unnerved by his return. Behind the closed doors of Hollywood's elite circles, the whispers grew louder and uglier. At a lavish private dinner, a top producer sneered, "This guy just doesn't get it. His time is over, but he's too stubborn to fade away. If he actually pulls this off, it could ruin everything we've built." The entitlement in their voices was palpable, an unshakable belief that they were the arbiters of culture, morality, and what stories the world should be allowed to see. "Someone has to stop him," another chimed in, their tone dripping with venom. These weren't conversations about cinema. They were declarations of war, fueled by the fear that Gibson's vision might expose the hollowness of their carefully curated narratives. While Hollywood schemed, Gibson focused on the things that mattered most to him. At home, surrounded by his children and close friends like Mark Wahlberg, he found strength in his faith and family. Wahlberg, who had starred in Flight Risk, had become one of his fiercest allies. "Man, they're terrified of you," Wahlberg said one evening over dinner. "Good," Gibson replied, his voice steady. "They should be. It means we're hitting a nerve." Hollywood's campaign to silence him was as predictable as it was vicious. Coordinated social media attacks began almost immediately after his announcement. #BoycottMel trended for days, with self-righteous commentators branding him divisive, dangerous, and out of touch. The same industry that celebrated empty platitudes about diversity now rallied to crush a man who dared to challenge their monopoly on truth. But Gibson didn't flinch. In interviews, he refused to engage with their vitriol, instead focusing on his vision. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about faith, family, and the kind of stories that remind us who we are. If that makes me unpopular, so be it." For every attack, there was a groundswell of support from everyday Americans who saw Gibson as a symbol of resilience. They were tired of Hollywood's condescension and craved stories rooted in timeless values, not fleeting trends. The battle lines were clear: an entitled, self-absorbed elite determined to suppress a man who refused to bend, and a growing movement of people rallying behind someone who stood for something bigger than himself. As Gibson pressed forward, the stakes couldn't have been higher, and the opposition couldn't have been uglier. The moment news broke that Mel Gibson was meeting with investors for the resurrection of the Christ, Hollywood erupted in a frenzy of outrage. Social media lit up with coordinated attacks, with hashtags like #BoycottMel flooding timelines, accusing him of being divisive and dangerously out of touch. Critics who hadn't seen a frame of his vision painted it as a project rooted in bigotry, too archaic for modern audiences. The mob, self-assured in their righteousness, demanded his silence. Leading the charge were industry darlings who masqueraded their disdain as concern. On a late-night talk show, a prominent actress, draped in designer self-importance, sneered, "We don't need more projects that divide us. Can't he just make something entertaining?" Her words, met with smug applause, echoed the industry's hypocrisy. Entertainment was acceptable, so long as it conformed to their narrow worldview. Mark Wahlberg, who had grown tired of the endless virtue signaling, called Mel to warn him. "Man, they're gunning for you already," he said, his tone carrying both frustration and admiration. Mel's reply was unshaken. "They've been gunning for me for 20 years, he said, a trace of dry humor in his voice. "I'm still here, aren't I?" It was true. He had faced this firestorm before, but the bitterness from Hollywood's elite had only grown more toxic. This time it wasn't just about Gibson. They saw his project as an existential threat to their control. A film centered on Christ's resurrection? It was everything they despised. Faith, redemption, and a direct challenge to their monopoly on shaping culture. As if the outrage over his film wasn't enough, Gibson's appointment as a special ambassador to Hollywood by President-elect Donald Trump ignited another wave of hysteria. Critics, drunk on their own smugness, called it a joke and proof Gibson was out of touch with reality. The media gleefully ran headlines mocking both men, framing the role as a desperate stunt. In truth, the appointment was a symbolic gesture, one that underscored just how deeply out of sync Hollywood's elite was with ordinary Americans. To them, Gibson's ties to Trump weren't just offensive, they were heretical. The attacks, though predictable, grew increasingly vicious. Anonymous insiders leaked rumors that major studios had blacklisted Gibson's project, refusing to distribute it under any circumstances. The entitlement of these power brokers was breathtaking. They openly reveled in their belief that they alone held the keys to the cultural narrative, and anyone who challenged their dominance deserved to be erased. Yet Gibson remained unmoved. He refused to stoop to their level, instead doubling down on his quiet conviction. To him, this wasn't about ego or revenge. It was about something far greater, standing for truth in a world that seemed determined to bury it. For every vitriolic tweet, there was an outpouring of support from fans who saw Gibson as a man who wouldn't bow to the mob. They admired his courage, his steadfastness, and his refusal to compromise. Hollywood may have declared war, but the fight was far from over. Gibson wasn't just battling for his film. He was battling for the values that defined him, and those who stood with him weren't about to let him fight alone. The betrayal hit harder than any headline. A key collaborator from Flight Risk, someone Mel Gibson had trusted, publicly distanced themselves in a scathing interview. Their words cut deep. Working with Mel was a mistake. He's too polarizing, and the industry doesn't need that kind of energy. The phrase, too polarizing, was a favorite weapon of Hollywood's elite, thinly veiled code for anyone who dared to challenge their carefully curated narratives. The collaborator wasn't just stepping away, they were throwing him to the wolves. The media pounced on the story with glee, spinning it as definitive proof that even those closest to Gibson couldn't stomach him. Headlines screamed accusations of toxicity, and talking heads dissected his every move, painting him as a relic of a bygone era clinging desperately to relevance. Mark Wahlberg, ever loyal, was one of the few willing to stand by Mel publicly. In a fiery statement, he declared, "Polarizing? Sure. But you know what else he is? A visionary. The kind of guy this town desperately needs, but is too scared to admit it." Wahlberg's defense was a rare glimmer of decency in an industry so consumed by self-interest that loyalty was a foreign concept. Yet, even as his friends stood by him, the betrayal stung. This wasn't a stranger attacking him from the shadows. This was someone Mel had invited into his world, someone who had seen the man behind the headlines and still chose to twist the knife. That night, Mel returned home, exhausted not from the attacks, but from the relentlessness of the machine working against him. His house, warm and alive with the chatter of his family, was his sanctuary. At dinner, his daughter, now grown, noticed the weariness in his eyes. "Dad," she said, her voice steady and certain, "they can say what they want, but you've taught us to fight for what's right. That's what matters." Her words struck a chord deep within him, reminding him why he had chosen this path in the first place. Hollywood's noise, its petty betrayals and orchestrated campaigns, paled in comparison to the strength he drew from his family and his faith. The ugliness of the industry was on full display. The collaborators' betrayal wasn't about principles. It was a calculated move to protect their own standing in an environment where virtue signaling was currency and convictions were liabilities. Gibson had seen this entitlement before. The belief that careers, legacies, and reputations were playthings for the powerful to manipulate. But for every whisper campaign, there was an undeniable truth the elites couldn't erase. Mel's story resonated with millions who saw him not as a pariah, but as a man willing to stand firm in the face of relentless opposition. As the night wore on, Mel found himself not bitter, but resolved. The betrayal had been painful, but it only served to clarify his mission. Hollywood might worship at the altar of self-preservation, but he would remain true to the values that had carried him through every storm. If the fight had to continue, he was ready. After all, the stakes weren't just a movie. They were the very principles he had built his life upon. The backlash against Mel Gibson reached a fever pitch as Hollywood insiders doubled down on their efforts to bury the resurrection of the Christ before it even began. Whispers of boycotts turned into organized smear campaigns, with anonymous sources gleefully telling the press that the project was dead in the water. Studio executives smugly peddled the narrative that no major distributor would touch the film, hoping to dissuade investors and choke the project before it gained traction. The entitlement of these power players was on full display. An industry that claimed to champion creativity was openly conspiring to silence one of its boldest voices. They mocked him behind closed doors, sneering that his brand of traditional values had no place in their vision of the future. Mel, however, refused to play by their rules. Instead of groveling for acceptance, he went straight to the people who mattered most, his audience. In a raw, unscripted video posted to social media, he spoke directly to the fans who had stood by him through decades of controversy and opposition. His words carried the weight of conviction, his voice steady and clear. "This story isn't just mine, it's yours," he said, looking directly into the camera. "If you believe in truth, family, and faith, let's show them what we can do together." The simplicity of the message, paired with his genuine sincerity, struck a chord that Hollywood elites could never understand. It wasn't about money, prestige, or awards. It was about connection, values, and the stories that reflected the heart of the people watching. The video went viral almost instantly, sparking a movement that even the most cynical critics couldn't ignore. Social media flooded with messages of support as ordinary Americans rallied behind Gibson's vision. The hashtags that once targeted him with hate were replaced by tags like #StandWithMel and #TruthMatters, amplified by conservative influencers who saw his fight as emblematic of a larger cultural battle. Suddenly, the narrative began to shift, and the elites who had dismissed him as irrelevant found themselves confronted by a groundswell of support they hadn't anticipated. Mark Wahlberg, always in Gibson's corner, took it a step further. Using his production company Unrealistic Ideas, he publicly announced his involvement as a producer for The Resurrection. In a press release, he stated, "This isn't just a movie, it's a message. And it's a message that people need now more than ever." Wahlberg's backing wasn't just a personal gesture. It was a calculated move to give the project credibility and force Hollywood to take notice. The entitlement of Hollywood's gatekeepers was met with something they couldn't control: genuine, grassroots passion. The industry that prided itself on dictating cultural trends suddenly found itself blindsided by the people it had long ignored. The fight was far from over, but Gibson and his supporters had proven one thing: they wouldn't be silenced. The expose hit Hollywood like a thunderclap, ripping away the veneer of tolerance and inclusivity that the industry so proudly displayed. Leaked emails between top studio executives revealed a coordinated effort to blacklist faith-based filmmakers, with Mel Gibson at the center of their ire. The messages were dripping with contempt. Phrases like "keep him out for good" and "don't let him near major distribution," exposing the raw, unfiltered disdain they held for anyone who dared to challenge their control over the cultural narrative. The entitlement was staggering. These weren't just business decisions. This was an orchestrated campaign to crush dissent, to ensure that stories rooted in faith and traditional values never saw the light of day. The public reaction was immediate and furious. Even typically neutral outlets began to question the motives behind such a blatant power grab. Headlines read, "What is Hollywood so afraid of?" and "Faith-based filmmakers, a threat to the status quo." The emails painted a damning picture of an industry terrified of losing its grip, willing to destroy careers and silence voices to maintain their ideological monopoly. For years, Hollywood had cloaked itself in the rhetoric of diversity and inclusion, but this revelation laid bare its true nature. An insular, entitled elite determined to dictate not just what people watched, but what they believed. Mel Gibson, for his part, remained calm in the face of the firestorm. He saw the exposé not as a vindication of his struggle, but as an opportunity to expose the deeper rot at the heart of the industry. In an emotional interview that quickly went viral, he spoke not of his own persecution, but of the larger implications of the revelations. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "It's about what they don't want you to see. It's about faith, family, and the truths that connect us all. But the truth always finds a way." His words struck the nerve, resonating far beyond the usual divides of politics and culture. It wasn't just a defense of his work. It was a rallying cry for everyone who felt alienated by the industry's increasingly aggressive efforts to marginalize traditional values. The tide began to shift. Social media, once a battleground of hostility, now saw a groundswell of support for Gibson. People shared stories of how his films had inspired them, how his courage had given them hope. The hashtags #TruthAlwaysWins and #FaithMatters trended for days, drowning out the noise of his detractors. Conservative leaders and faith-based organizations amplified his message, turning what had been a personal battle into a cultural movement. Hollywood's elites, so accustomed to shaping the narrative, found themselves on the defensive. Their arrogance, their entitlement, their blatant disdain for the people they claimed to entertain, it was all laid bare. For the first time in years, they weren't the ones in control. Mel Gibson, armed with nothing but his unwavering conviction, had turned the tables. The fight was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted. The pressure on Hollywood was unbearable. After the exposé revealed their coordinated efforts to silence faith-based filmmakers like Mel Gibson, public outrage swelled to a point even the industry couldn't ignore. Studio heads, once smug in their belief that they could dictate cultural norms, found themselves in the crosshairs of a movement they never anticipated. Theaters, previously hesitant to risk the wrath of the industry elite, began to cave under the weight of grassroots demand. First, smaller chains announced they would re-release The Passion of the Christ. Then larger networks followed suit, unwilling to be left out of the phenomenon. What began as whispers turned into a roar, and Gibson's defiance was now bolstered by an undeniable wave of public support. Mel's grassroots campaign had worked. Against the full weight of an entitled, self-serving Hollywood establishment, he had stood firm, refusing to bow or compromise. Now, his voice carried further than ever, and his announcement that pre-production for the resurrection of the Christ would officially begin in late 2025 was met with thunderous applause from fans and supporters alike. The elites, for all their scheming, couldn't stop him. Their hatred and vitriol had only highlighted their desperation, exposing them as out-of-touch tyrants clinging to a crumbling empire. At a live Q&A session for Flight Risk, Gibson was relaxed, his demeanor calm despite the relentless battles waged against him. The audience was packed with supporters, and the atmosphere was electric, every question a chance to hear from a man who had become a symbol of unyielding strength. But not everyone in the room was on his side. A reporter, her tone sharp and accusatory, tried to puncture the moment. "You faced more backlash than anyone in this industry. Why keep going?" Her words dripped with the entitlement of someone who thought she held the power to define success, Someone who believed she could reduce decades of resilience to a cheap headline. Mel paused, the room falling silent as he weighed his response. Finally, he looked up, his voice steady but laced with conviction. Because this isn't about Hollywood. It's about faith, family, and truth. And those things? They never go out of style. His words hit like a hammer, cutting through the noise and pretense of the question. The audience erupted into applause, their cheers drowning out any doubt that might have lingered. In that moment, Mel wasn't just a filmmaker. He was a warrior standing against an industry that had tried and failed to erase him. As the event wrapped up, Mel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression briefly hardening as he read the message. Enjoy the win while it lasts. It was cryptic, ominous, and a reminder that the battle wasn't over. But for now, it didn't matter. The people were with him. The truth was on his side, and no amount of scheming from Hollywood's elite could change that. The fight would continue, but so would he. Please don't forget to watch more heartwarming stories that are showing on your screen. For more stories celebrating real human values, hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss our next uploads.